Hey, welcome to Q&A, where you ask your questions on faith and life, and I do my best to give a biblical perspective. Hey, got a question that I think arose out of something I said in a recent service, so let's jump straight in and answer it. Here's the question. You said the church is dependent on the Jews. Surely the new covenant replaces the old, which means the church replaces the Jews as God's chosen people, doesn't it? Right off the bat, let me just own the fact, if I didn't use those exact words, I certainly would have said something that expressed those sentiments, because it is something that I believe, it's something that I am committed to theologically, biblically. This position around the church replacing the Jews is what's known as, or replacing Israel is what's known as replacement theology. I don't get it. I don't buy into it. I don't think you can argue it from a biblical perspective, from a theological perspective, for a number of reasons. Having said that, if this is your question, I totally get where you're coming from, and I'm not judging you, I'm not condemning you. I mean, I think this is the default position for many Christians without thinking critically, without reading the scriptures. The language itself tends to push us in that direction. New versus old, new covenant, old covenant. I mean, think about it. You buy a new car because you're replacing an old car. You buy new shoes because you're replacing old shoes. And so by default, just the language, the terminology we use can push us to this position. But as I say, I don't hold it, and I don't hold it for a number of reasons. We don't have time to go into it in depth, but let me give you an overview of why I don't, and why I don't think it's appropriate to say that the church replaces Israel. First off, I know that some people claim, even Paul talks this way. They look to verses such as Galatians chapter 6. I think it's about verse 15, 16. Let me bring it up here. Here we go. Where Paul says, that it doesn't matter whether we have been circumcised or not. What counts is whether we've been transformed into a new creation. Verse 16. This is Galatians chapter 6, verse 16. He says, may God's peace and mercy be upon all who live by this principle, that we're a new creation through the cross of Christ. They are the new people of God. And I've heard people say, see, even Paul, the great apostle, the one who wrote so much of the New Testament, even he says that because of this new covenant, God has a new people, and that's the church. But I don't think that does justice to everything that Paul has to say, and I think it misses the point, because I don't think Paul pits the church against Israel in the way that some would see this verse as doing. They miss the point. He's talking about a new people as a consequence of responding to the Messiah, to the cross of Christ. If you look at everything else he says, he would contradict that superficial or cursory reading of the new people being the church. For example, in Romans 11, where he talks a lot about the relationship of the church to Israel, he begins by saying, let me bring it up here, has God rejected his own people, the nation of Israel? Of course not. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham and a people of the tribe of Benjamin. No, God has not rejected his own people, whom he chose from the very beginning. So right off the bat, Paul says that God has not rejected Israel. And so everything that he says about the relationship of the church to Israel, the new covenant versus the old covenant, has to be understood from this perspective. He's not pitting one against another. He's not saying that because of the cross of Christ, the church now is the replacement of Israel. There's a new covenant, a new group of people in town. Israel's done and dusted. That's why he goes on and he says, verse 11, did God's people stumble and fall beyond recovery? He's acknowledging that they have not kept the covenant. They have not honored the law. They have not responded to God the way that God has wooed them and desires them, and the way that God had set up the relationship. But he acknowledges that disobedience. But he says that as a consequence of that, God's made salvation available to us. And then he goes on, he says, why has God made it available to us? Because he wants his own people to become jealous and claim it for themselves. So they're not done and dusted. The church has not replaced Israel in Paul's thinking. He's saying that, yep, they have been rebellious, and yes, there is a new covenant, but that's not at the exclusion of Israel. In fact, he says, I want you, the church, to live in such ways that provoke them to see, hey, there's something going on here that we have not tapped into, we've not accessed, we've not entered into. There's a relationship with God that we haven't experienced. Let's explore this for ourselves. And he's saying this is how you should live. And that's why he goes on in verse 17. He says, if some of the branches have been broken off, some of the tribes of Israel, some of because of the hardness of heart, the rejection of the relationship, the abandonment of the covenant, he says these have been broken off. And because of that, wild olive slips, which is the church, have been grafted in amongst them. And we now share in the nourishing sap from the olive root. However, don't consider yourself as a consequence to be superior to the other branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. In other words, we don't support Israel. Israel supports us. The new covenant is underpinned, grows out of, is supported, is rooted in the old covenant. The new covenant is the fulfillment of the old covenant. It doesn't replace it, it's the fulfillment. He says if branches were broken off, that we could be grafted in. So therefore, if they were broken off because of unbelief and we stand by faith, don't be arrogant, but tremble. In other words, tremble at the grace of God, for if God did not spare them, then why would he spare us? You see, I think sometimes we forget that Paul's theology is shaped by the Old Testament in ways we often don't want to acknowledge. Remember, he's a Pharisee of the Pharisees. And so when he talks about the new covenant in relation to the old, when he talks about a new people of God, when he talks about the Gentiles being grafted in, he's not thinking replacement because he's acutely aware of the promises that God made to Israel. So, for example, in Jeremiah 31, where God is talking through Jeremiah to Israel and in their rebellion against him and their rejection of God, God says, I will make a new covenant with Israel and Judah. And then in verse 33, he says, this is the covenant I'll make with the people of Judah, of Israel, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and I will write it in their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. You see, so Paul sees the new covenant as the fulfillment of what was promised to Israel. And that's why he talks about us being grafted in instead of replacing, because this promise still stands. There's still the opportunity for them to enter into it, because the old was about external observances. The new is about an internal heart that is oriented towards God, that is shaped by the cross of Christ, by the Messiah who fulfilled the purposes of the law, thus rendering that obsolete. But it hasn't done away with Israel. It's saying Jesus is the fulfillment of this promise of, I will write the law in their hearts and on their minds. So Paul doesn't buy replacement. He's not saying it's either or. When he talks about a new people of God because of the new covenant, he's talking about how the root and the branches that are grafted in come together to form something together. Think of it as a family. You know, if you're the oldest in your family, when you had younger siblings, they didn't replace you, did they? Yes, the relationship is different. Your parents may well engage with each of you in different ways, but you're all part of the family. And even if you have, or you were the rebellious person in your family, you have got rebellious kids, they're still part of the family, even if they don't enter into the fullness of what it means to be family, even if they exclude themselves from time to time, even if they push back, they're still part of the family. And that's what Paul is saying in Romans, that they're still part of the family. And we should live in ways that help them see that their rejection and their abandonment of God hasn't changed God's love and his attitude toward them, and it should provoke them to jealousy to enter into this promise that God gave in Jeremiah 31 as the fulfillment of his eternal covenant with Israel. And the reason I say that is that, there's plenty of scriptures that talk about the covenant that God made with Israel being everlasting. For example, in Genesis 17, where God establishes the covenant with Abraham, he talks about how in verse 7, it's an everlasting covenant between God and Abraham and his descendants forever. Now, there are other verses that speak like that. And my question is this: if God changes his word on that, on what he gave his word and said it's an everlasting covenant, if he changes that and says, you know what, I've changed my mind, I've got a new people, you're gone, where's our confidence and hope through Christ? If he did it then, why do we say he won't do it again? The reason we say he won't do it, he won't change his mind, is because the Bible says God doesn't change his mind. There's no turning in him in that way. His word stands forever. So that means that however we understand the relationship of the new covenant to the old covenant, the church in relation to Israel, it's got to factor in that God made eternal promises and they haven't changed. And we have to recognize that what we call the new covenant, it had its foundations in a promise to Israel in the old as the fulfillment of it. And so therefore, however we understand the relationship, it's got to factor all these in. Now, it doesn't mean to say that the older brother Israel enjoys the benefits of the relationship the way that we do, because it's still in rebellion, it's still turned its back. But it does mean that God will deal with Israel in his own time, and we read about that in the book of Revelation. And that's why Paul tells us to live in ways that reflect the promise of Jeremiah 31, the new covenant through the cross of Christ, to provoke them into jealousy. I want that. Think of the prodigal son. The young brother went away in that context, and then he thought, hold on, I'm missing out, and he came back. We're to live in ways that make Israel want to enter into what we have entered into. And as they do it, it's no longer about whether they are circumcised or not. It's not about Jew or Gentile. It's about being renewed, transformed through the cross of Christ. And that's why Paul says there's a new people of God. So, yeah, the new covenant doesn't mean we have replaced Israel. So, yeah, I just want to clear that up. It means we have a special relationship. It means we have to honor the older brother. We have to live in ways that recognize that. The law is no longer an external observance. It's an internal thing through the cross of Christ, and we live out of that. So, yeah, that's how I understand the relationship. I'd love to hear your views on that. But as always, if you've got questions on faith and life, you can ask them on slido.com. Use the hashtag ALC22. But that's it for now. Until next time, God bless.